Hello, I'm David Ashrick, the presenter of the Why God? 12 Big Questions for God series. In this series, we take a look at very important, very pressing, and very urgent questions. Things like, what happens when I die? How can I postpone my funeral? What happened to the church? And why do children suffer? I hope you enjoy watching this series as much as I enjoyed presenting it, and I invite you to take a look, an in-depth look at the excellent answer to these pressing and important questions. This is I would have to think about it. It's either my fourth or my fifth trip to Australia. Love this country, love the people, but I do have to say that I really don't love being up on a stage so high like this. This is unusual for me. I'd prefer to be down there, closer to you. But you can admire my shoes, and they are quite splendid, I might say. So let me just sort of tell you what this is going to be and what this is not going to be. First of all, what this is not going to be is a churchy event where you are preached at. In fact, more than anything else, what I'm trying to do here, I am unapologetically a Christian. Make no apologies for that. And at the same time, I find myself often embarrassed by things that Christians do and things that Christians say. Probably some of you who are believers might feel similarly. When I became a Christian when I was 23 years old, almost 24 years old. I was studying pre-medicine at a university in the States, the University of Wyoming. And really what ended up happening in my experience was that I met some people who were intelligent and who were wonderful and friendly and who could answer many of the questions that I had about God and about faith that I myself probably didn't even know that I had. I hadn't articulated them really probably up to that point, but as I began to interact with these people, it dawned on me that they were answering questions and providing a framework for me that I wished that somebody had done when I was younger, maybe when I was 20 or even younger, the thing I'm trying to provide for my children now. And so rather than this being a church environment where you'll be preached at, what I'd rather have this be is a situation where I can just sort of speak to you openly, speak to you transparently about some of the things that I wished people would have told me when I was even younger than I was at the age of 23. I've had the privilege of traveling all around the world and meeting people, and as I do that, I find that many of the questions that people have are similar. The same kinds of questions when it comes to God, when it comes to Jesus, when it comes to the Bible, when it comes to the issue of suffering. The questions seem to run in very similar veins, and so the idea behind this series is just really a series of 12 questions. That's why the subtitle is 12 Big Questions for God, in which every one of the questions is sort of directed at God. Now, somebody might ask, reasonably, intuitively, well, how can you ask a question of God, and is He going to show up and answer? And the answer is, not that I know of, I don't know if God's planning on putting in an appearance, but I wouldn't mind it if He did that. More than likely, that will not happen. So what we're going to see here is what about the biblical worldview? What about the biblical perspective? What are the answers to these questions? Now, for many of you, that is going to be immediately off-putting. I know it would have been for me when I was a purple-haired punk rocker at the age of 23 and people began to talk to me about the Bible and about Jesus and about God. It was immediately off-putting, and I'm aware enough of the reasonably secular and modern state of Australia to know that for some of you that's going to sound already a little hokey and a little superstitious. So let me just try and explain here just a moment. When we talk about a worldview, when philosophers or sociologists talk about a worldview, what they're talking about is just exactly what the word sounds like. Two words, worldview. That is to say, it's the way that you view the world. You might liken it to a set of glasses. right? If I hold my glasses out here at arm's length, I can see my glasses, right? They're in front of me. But as I bring these glasses, and especially the lenses, closer to my eyes, I can still see them, But as the glasses get closer and closer to my eyes, I cease to see the glasses, and I begin to see everything through the glasses or through the lenses. That's what a worldview is. A worldview is the way that you view the world, the systematic way that you view the world. And there are lots of different worldviews available. There are people who are what are called atheists, who deny the existence of God in a positive sense. There are agnostics who say they just don't know. There are Buddhists, there are Muslims, there are Jews, there are Christians, there are people who are just Epicureans, hedonists, and just want to have a good time. People have ways that they view the world, and those ways that they view the world impact everything that comes into their mind and into their frame of reference, even if they're unaware of it. Even if you are not aware of exactly how your worldview impacts the way that you're viewing things around you, in fact it is. In just a few moments here, I'll forget that I have my glasses on. Right now I'm aware of it. My brain is tuned into the fact that I have my glasses on. But in just a moment, my awareness of the glasses will go away, and I will just begin to see everything through my glasses. What I'm going to try to do in this series is present 12 answers. Now, I'm going to be right up front with you here. 12 what I consider to be excellent answers, profound answers, life-changing answers, superb answers to questions about the nature of life, the nature of man, how do we know God is there, and what about suffering? Now, we're going to sort of walk through this in what I consider to be a linear and logical fashion, and we're going to start with what might seem to be a bit of an unusual place. We're asking a question, I think I've got it here, who was right, Jesus or Darwin? Now, what this question is going to do for us, we're going to sort of take a look at two towering figures in human history. Towering figures in so many senses, but in the sense that I'm discussing here tonight, that what they did and how they lived and the things that they said and the discoveries that they made and the things that they revealed radically impacted hundreds and thousands and even hundreds of thousands and millions of people since their time. Jesus Christ 2,000 years ago and Charles Darwin just roughly not quite 200 years ago are two men that have phenomenally and foundationally and fundamentally impacted the way that human beings view themselves, the way that human beings view relationships, and the way that human beings view God, if in fact He is there. And so the whole seminar series is titled Why God? And we're just going to simply try to provide answers to questions that I frequently encounter and that I would hazard a guess that many of you are asking. Are we going to be talking about the Bible? Yes, but in a way that I think you will find certainly non-offensive, but also intellectually stimulating. Something that will give you something to think about. And let me just say one final word on that. When I say to you that I am unapologetically a Christian, I want to be clear what I'm saying and what I'm not saying. When I say that I'm a Christian, I am not saying that I agree with everything that Christians have ever done or that they believe or say or do. There is such a broad swath of what exactly Christian is and what Christianity is that what I mean very simply is the simple biblical answers to life's most basic questions and people who are seeking to live in harmony with the way that Jesus Himself lived. And so with that mild caveat out of the way, let's talk a little bit tonight about this question of who was right, Jesus or Darwin. Now, you probably know who the man on the right is. Who is that? That's W, isn't it? George W. Bush. And he is pinning a medal on somebody. And let me tell you about that medal. That medal is what is called the Presidential Freedom Medal, or the Presidential Freedom Award. In fact, it is the very highest award that can be bestowed on a civilian in the United States of America. That is the very highest award that you can receive. The man that George W. Bush is pinning that medal on, this was when he was the President of the United States, is a man by the name of Dr. Ben Carson. Dr. Ben Carson. Now, let me just tell you a little bit about Dr. Ben Carson and why he's receiving this Presidential Freedom Medal. Dr. Ben Carson is a neurosurgeon. He is somebody who does surgery on people's brains, but he's not just a run-of-the-mill neurosurgeon, if there is such a thing. He actually is considered by many to be perhaps the most gifted neurosurgeon in the world today, and maybe the most gifted neurosurgeon that has ever lived. Some might say one of the most gifted, perhaps the most gifted surgeon that has ever lived. In 1987, Dr. Ben Carson performed the first, what's called a hemispherectomy, which is basically the separation of two conjoined Siamese twins. They were called the Binder twins. They were from Germany, and this took place in 1987. And the degree of difficulty and the degree of bravery that it would have taken to perform a surgery of this nature is really impossible for those of us who are not neurosurgeons to appreciate. The surgery took hours and hours and hours, and the risk was exceedingly high. There was a chance that one of the twins could be lost because they were joined literally at the head. Both of them were awake, both of them were intelligent. There were two human beings stuck at the head, conjoined Siamese twins. And one risk was that one of the twins would be lost. The other risk, of course, was that the other twin would be lost. But the larger risk was that both could conceivably be lost. It was a very dangerous, very technical, very brave surgery. And amazingly, astoundingly, to everyone's astonishment, the surgery was totally successful. And not only was this was not only the first surgery of this kind or of this nature that Dr. Carson performed, he wanted to perform other similar kinds of surgeries. And frankly, he was rocketed to the equivalent of medical superstardom. And he's currently the director of pediatric neurosurgery in what is arguably the most prestigious hospital in the world, Johns Hopkins Research Hospital in Baltimore, Maryland. Now, in addition to his surgery, he also runs a wonderful philanthropic organization that sends hundreds and thousands of gifted young people and children who are underprivileged into academic situations where they can have a positive influence in the community around them and they can grow themselves. Now, here's kind of the fascinating thing. Dr. Carson has received, getting close to 50 honorary degrees and has published more than 100 papers on neuroscience and neurosurgery. And he's also a well-known charismatic speaker, and he's invited to speak in various and sundry venues. And he is often invited to speak at commencement exercises for universities, sometimes very prestigious universities, the most prestigious universities, and speak at their graduation services. Well, in 3 days, today is May 11th, I think, in 3 days, Dr. Carson is going to be speaking at Emory University. This is just the book here, the book that's about him. Let me just skip ahead here for a moment. This is actually, just before I get to Emory University, not only was a book written about Dr. Carson, but a film starring none other than Academy Award winner Cuba Gooding Jr., a film called Gifted Hands, The Ben Carson Story, came out in 2009. Excellent film. My boys have seen it, I've seen it, excellent film. So the guy is a well-known person and somebody that is really an extraordinary individual and an extraordinary human being. But there's a great big problem with Dr. Ben Carson. And the problem we're going to see here in just a moment is really under the microscope with something that's taking place right now and is due to take place 3 days from now at Emory University. Now, Emory University is, according to U.S. News and World Report, one of the 20 top universities in the United States of America. It's a research university with some 14,000 students. It was actually founded, interestingly and ironically enough, we'll discover in just a moment, by Methodists in 1836. The name Emory University comes from a bishop by the name of John Emory, and Dr. Carson has been asked to speak at Emory University. Okay, so he's been asked to come and speak to the graduating class of 2012. All is fine, all is good. He's done this scores of times before. However, all is not fine and good. There are 500 students who have written a letter, not 500 who have written it, but a letter has been written of which 500 students, faculty, professors, and alumni, combination thereof, have signed this letter arguing for caution and protesting against Dr. Carson speaking to the graduates of Emory University. Now, somebody might say, why? Why would that be? Why would 500 faculty members and a combination of faculty members and students and alumni sign a paper that says, hey, we have serious reservations and serious cautions about this man speaking to our students? Well, it's fascinating. The issue actually boils down to what Dr. Carson believes in his own personal religious life. He is a Christian and a Seventh-day Adventist Christian, and as a Seventh-day Adventist Christian, he does not believe in one of the great modern dogmas of today, and that is evolution. And this has now come under severe scrutiny, such that there are these signatories that are suggesting that perhaps he should be disinvited from speaking, an event that's supposed to take place just 3 days from now. Now, let me just read you the 2 opening paragraphs of the letter that the 500 individuals, almost 500, it's 494 at this point, have signed, and follow the nature of their complaint, follow the nature of their concern. Notice the very first sentence. It says, "We are writing to call the attention of the Emory community to this year's commencement speaker's denial of evolution." It's the very first thing. We want to call the community of Emory University to an awareness that this guy does not believe in evolution. Dr. Ben Carson is a world-renowned neurosurgeon who has advanced medicine and who has supported the education of countless children through his philanthropic organization. These accomplishments can provide a great inspiration to graduating Emory students, but as those students, their families, and the Emory community listen to his speech, we ask you also to consider the enormous positive impact of science on our lives and how that science rests squarely on the shoulders of evolution. What is most deeply concerning about Dr. Carson's dismissal of evolution is that he equates the acceptance of evolution with a lack of ethics and morality. He states, this is Dr. Carson now, this is from an interview that he conducted, "Ultimately, if you accept the evolutionary theory, you dismiss ethics." That's a way of saying morality. "You don't have to abide by a set of moral codes. You determine your own conscience based on your own desires." Now, this was an interview that Dr. Carson gave, and somebody got a hold of this interview, found out that he was a Seventh-day Adventist, that he was a Christian, and they said, "Whoa!" Even though this guy is arguably the top neurosurgeon in the world today, and certainly one of the most respected doctors of any stripe, we need to have serious reservations about this person speaking to our students because of what he believes. Now, here's kind of the interesting thing about all of this. If you read very carefully the concern that the individuals who wrote and signed the letter, their major concern is not just that Dr. Carson doesn't believe in evolution. That's the primary concern. But the undergirding concern is that he also believes that if you believe in evolution, if the evolutionary theory, that you don't have a ground, something to stand on for ethics and moral codes, and you can just do whatever you want. As he says, you determine your own conscience based on your own desires. Now, to be fair, exceedingly fair to Dr. Carson, he is not saying that people who believe in the evolutionary theory are unethical. He's not suggesting that. He's not saying that people who believe in the evolutionary theory are not kind or gracious or magnanimous people. No, 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 no. What he's simply saying is that if you believe in that you lose the ability to ground your morality or your ethics in anything that is permanent and transcendent. Now that raises a question. Number one, is Dr. Carson right? And number two, so what? Is it actually the case that if we adopt an evolutionary perspective, and we're going to see here in just a moment where we're going to lay this evolutionary perspective at the feet, it's going to be at the feet of Charles Darwin, does that have broader implications for our worldview? Are there broader implications, or is it just simply believing that there was a small organism, and then a more complex organism, and then a still more complex organism, and eventually we evolved from more simple organisms through a common ancestor? Is that all it is, or is there something more at stake here? Well, in order to sort of unpack what's taking place there at Emory University, the controversy, the unusual controversy that's taking place right now, we're going to have to try and understand who this man is here. We all know who this man is. This is Charles Darwin. He was born in England in 1809, and he studied at Cambridge University. It's fascinating and not well known by most people that he actually went to Cambridge University to study for the priesthood. He wanted to be a priest in the Church of England, and he was a devout young man. In fact, by all of the accounts that I've read, he was a very friendly, very congenial, very intelligent young man, and he wanted to go to what he esteemed to be the highest and best position that a human being could occupy, and that was none other than the priesthood for the Church of England. And of course, his desire to do that was going to require study. But an interesting thing happened. Rather than finishing up his priesthood studies, he actually, in 1831, at a young age, just about 22 years old, he was given an opportunity to go on a ship, an exploratory mission on a ship called the HMS Beagle. And he took that opportunity up, actually fascinatingly enough, the reason that he did not take the holy orders for the Church of England was because he just didn't feel worthy of it. He didn't think he was ready. He didn't think he was worthy. He did not feel, as he said, the unction of the Spirit. And so he opted not to receive the holy orders and go on to the priesthood, and he was given an opportunity to go on an exploratory journey, scientific journey, a naturalist journey on a ship called the HMS Beagle, which he did beginning in 1831. The voyage would last some 5 years and would take him really from England, of course, to South America, the east coast of South America, around Cape Horn, and up to, most famously, the Galapagos Islands. He would remain in Galapagos for quite a while, then would sail actually to New Zealand, then to Australia, to Western Australia, around the Cape of Good Hope, back to South America briefly, and then back to England. The journey would take 5 years. And during that time, Darwin was a bit of an amateur naturalist. He would be collecting specimens of various kind, making observations, and he wrote tremendously. Even though he was very sick on the journey, he suffered from terrible seasickness and other kinds of illnesses. But he was, perhaps his gift more than any other was the ability to observe and to take very detailed and specific notes. And he wrote and wrote and wrote and wrote. And after he got back from his journey, he began to think about so many of the things that he'd seen, new animals and new plants and new birds and new places and new people. He'd had so many amazing experiences that over the course of further reflection and further study, in 1859, he published a book that many would say is arguably the single most important book of the last 500 years. And that book was published in 1859. It's titled On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection. On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection. And this was really Darwin's take on how speciation came to be. Where did things come from, and how did they come to be, and why does the diversity and the various ecological niches that various animals and birds fill, how did they come to fill those niches? And this is his take on it. It's very interesting. He actually talks very little about the origin of species and more about the variety of species and the evolution of species. The second half of the title really gives the point away. The origin of species by means of natural selection. Now, Darwin's basic idea here, he was not the founder of evolutionary theory. The evolutionary idea existed for, at least 100 years before the time of Darwin. But what Darwin was able to do was make evolution scientifically credible, scientifically believable. He gave a veneer of scientific credibility and eventually even a foundation of scientific credibility to the idea of evolution. At first, his ideas were sort of lukewarmly received, but over time, in fact, somewhat rapidly, it sort of had a snowballing effect. People began to see Darwinism as the universal solvent, as something that could answer a variety of questions in a variety of contexts, not only in the biological world, but eventually in the psychological world, the sociological world, and even other realms of academic discipline. Now, thinking about Darwin and about his discovery, it's quite interesting what happened to his belief in Christianity. As he began to drift away there in 1831 from England, at about the same pace, he also began to drift away from his religious convictions. It was not something that happened immediately. It did not happen overnight. In fact, in Darwin's own words, his religious convictions died a natural death. He did not renounce his religion. It just sort of went away by virtue of his increasing interest in natural things and science, eclipsing what had formerly been the energies that he had devoted to religious things. In 1835, he wrote a letter, and he was actually writing a letter to a young man by the name of Mr. Fox, who himself had studied alongside Darwin in the university, and was going on to become a clergyman. And it's very interesting how Darwin writes here. This is 4 years into his journey, and you get a sense here that he's still writing very favorably, though perhaps a little bit aloof, about the office of the clergy. He writes and he says, "I dare hardly look forward to the future, for I do know that I do not know what will become of me. Your situation," writing to his friend, "is above envy. I do not venture to even frame such happy visions. To a person fit to take the office, the life of a clergyman is a type of all that is respectable and happy. So plainly what we see here is a man who had at least a deference and at least a respect for religion, but that would eventually find its way, it would eventually go away. It would find its way out of his thinking. B. Warfield in 1888, just a few years after Darwin's death, wrote these words. He said, "Thus the doctrine of evolution, once heartily adopted by him, gradually undermined his faith until he cast off the whole of Christianity as an unproved delusion. The process was neither rapid nor unopposed. He speaks of his unwillingness to give up his belief and of the slow rate at which unbelief crept over him, although it became at last complete." We're going to talk a little bit more about this idea tomorrow, a fascinating insight into why it is that Darwin began. There are very specific reasons as to why he began to give up his faith, and we'll get more into that tomorrow, but it has to do with the issue of suffering. Charles Darwin could not reconcile the amount of suffering and what he deemed to be inefficiency in the world with a God. And over time, this little wedge just began to go more deeply and deeply into his thinking until eventually, as we've just read, he cast off religion altogether. Now, this is actually Darwin from his book, Origin of Species, the introduction. This gets us helps us to begin to understand the nature of his thinking and really of his theory. He says, as many more individuals of each species are born than can possibly survive, and as consequently there is a frequently recurring struggle for existence, this is the inefficiency that I was mentioning, it follows that any being, if it vary however slightly in any manner profitable to itself, under the complex and sometimes varying conditions of life, will have a better chance of surviving, and here it is, and thus be, can you see the next two words there? What are those two words? Naturally selected. They would be naturally selected. From the strong principle of inheritance, any selected variety will tend to propagate its new and modified form. Darwin's basic theory can be boiled down to two ideas. How many ideas, everyone? Two ideas, two very simple ideas. Number one is the idea of common ancestry, that all living things trace their genesis back to a single common ancestor. So number one, the idea of common ancestry. Perhaps you in school, or certainly you in school, would have seen the so-called tree of life, where you have the single common ancestor here that comes up as a single trunk, and then you begin to have major branches, and then sub-branches, and then sub-sub-branches off of those branches. And it's all of this speciation that's taking place, but if you rewind the tape of life, it comes right back to a single ancestor. So number one, common ancestry. But the real contribution that Darwin made was this idea of natural selection. The idea that if an organism differed just slightly from others, if that difference, if that modification gave that organism a slight advantage over others, and this organism survived, this organism could then reproduce and pass on that fitness. Many of us have heard that term before. The survival of the fittest is really just a layman's way of saying natural selection. These two ideas were basically the hallmark of Darwin's theory of evolution, and were basically the thing that rocketed him eventually to such prominence and even popularity, such that today we don't even think about other kinds of evolution except in certain academic situations. For the most part, when people talk about evolution, they are talking about Darwinism. The things have become almost synonymous. There were other branches and ideas about evolution prior to the publication of Origin of Species, but Darwin changed all of that. And this is a cartoon that was published in 1871, basically gives the idea already that Darwin was becoming synonymous with the idea of common ancestry and natural selection. In his book, Darwin's God, Cornelius G. Hunter has this amazing thing to say about Darwinism and about evolution. He says, evolution is more than just a scientific theory, if only because of its tremendous influence in areas. What are those next words there? Can you read that? Outside of science. Hunter then says something that's amazing. It is probably the most influential idea ever generated by science. Now, what the author Hunter here is saying is that what makes evolution so, Darwinism, evolution, we're using those terms virtually synonymously now, What makes it so profound and so amazing, and arguably the single greatest, most influential idea ever produced by science, I think that you could make a strong case for Newtonian physics, but that's beside the point, is basically this idea, or Einsteinian physics for that matter, is this idea that evolution is not just a scientific theory, but it transcends science. It goes into other areas. It influences the humanities, it influences psychology, it influences... Now, you might say it this way. You might say that Darwin, to use your collective imagination here, that Darwin, as it were, stumbled upon a box. And he began to open that box. But unbeknownst to Darwin, it was a bit of a Pandora's box. And what seemed like reasonably harmless and reasonably innocuous initial observations and conclusions would be eventually taken from Charles Darwin to greater and still greater and still greater and still greater levels of extreme and intensity. And what ends up happening here is actually quite interesting. Such that in 1988, in the times in which we're living today, people, men like the late Dr. William B. Provine, could say at the keynote address in 1988 for what was called the Darwin Day experience, he could say this: naturalistic evolution, Darwinian evolution, has clear consequences that Charles Darwin understood perfectly. Oh, consequences. That sounds a little bit like what Dr. Ben Carson was saying. Consequences. If we believe this, then this follows from it. If this is our worldview, this is what it entails. He says naturalistic evolution has clear consequences that Charles Darwin understood perfectly. Number one, no gods worth having exist. Number two, no life after death exists. Number three, no ultimate foundation for ethics exists. 4, no ultimate meaning in life exists. And 5, human free will is non-existent. Now, if you're sitting there thinking, wow, that is quite an extrapolation from observing the beaks of a few finches on the islands of the Galapagos, exactly. But what Darwin did in opening the box, subsequent scientists and subsequent philosophers and subsequent evolutionists have opened and taken Darwin's message to what some would consider, myself in that number, an illogical and untenable extreme. Now, this reminds us of exactly Dr. Ben Carson's point. Remember, the thing that Carson said that was so offensive to the students, faculty, and some of the alumni, not all of them, of course, only 500 signatories, and there's almost 14,000 students at the university. But what was so offensive to them was not just that Darwin didn't believe in evolution, but that he suggested that Darwinism had implications, that it entailed something else. Let's read it again. He said, ultimately, if you accept the evolutionary theory, you dismiss ethics. You don't have to abide by a set of moral codes. You determine your own conscience based on your own desires. Now, Dr. Carson, because he's a Christian and he's coming from a biblical perspective, is having a whole big fuss, a whole big controversy and ruckus raised against him delivering the keynote address at Emory. But this is the very same thing that William Provine is saying here. No gods worth having, no life after death, and notice number 3, no ultimate foundation for ethics. That's the very point that Carson is making. So here an evolutionist is making it, but when a Christian makes it, it raises a significant issue. Now, what's the big deal? Isn't this just all academic? Isn't this something that's taking place in the upper echelons of learning? This is something for the William Provines and the Charles Darwins and the Ben Carsons of the world. Hey, I'm just a plumber. I'm just an accountant. I'm just a surfer or a college student, and this does not affect me. In fact, it does. Because as that box that Charles Darwin opened became increasingly open, these ideas began to leak out that became so transformative that I'm going to share some things with you now that are hard to believe. Not hard to believe. In fact, I would say they're impossible to believe. But it's hard to believe that people believe some of the things I'm going to share with you right now. In 1999, the blockbuster movie that has gone on to become a cult classic called The Matrix was released, starring Lawrence Fishburne and Keanu Reeves. And the basic idea behind the movie was that human beings were being used by machines. And not just used, but harvested by machines to propagate themselves. And what seems like a great big slice of science fiction, and we sort of laugh and say, oh, wouldn't that be something? You know, wouldn't that be amazing? In a rather strange twist of fate, this is not unlike what many people believe today, but not science fiction quacks or UFO abductees, but actually some of the most educated and intelligent and brilliant men in the world are suggesting that a situation similar to the Matrix is exactly what's happening, not just out in space somewhere, but in this very room. In fact, in your very body, something just analogous to the Matrix is taking place. You say, what? You lost me there. Well, let me try to find you if I can. This man is named Richard Dawkins. Many of you might know him. He's a New York Times bestselling author and scientist, and wrote a book, of course, many books, but the book he's probably best known for at this point is a book called The God Delusion. He's an avowed atheist, and has a number of very interesting ideas, a brilliant man, an intelligent man, quite a funny man, in fact. But listen to this very interesting idea here that he promotes. Listen to what Dawkins has to say here. The universe is nothing but a collection of atoms in motion. Nothing but a collection of atoms in motion. Of course, you, being in the universe and a part of the universe, are nothing but a collection of atoms in motion. And here you thought you were a human being, you thought you were an Australian, you thought you were a woman, you thought you were a man. Sorry. In fact, you are just a collection of atoms in motion. But it gets worse. Human beings are simply machines for propagating DNA, deoxyribonucleic acid molecule, and the propagation of DNA is a self-sustaining process. It is every living object's sole reason for living. Now let me try and unpack that. Basically what Darwin is suggesting here is something that he began to promote in his book in 1976 titled The Selfish Gene. I think I've got that here. The 30th anniversary of that book just took place in 2006, and it was re-released, and the idea of the selfish gene is pretty much just exactly what it sounds like. That the real culprits, or the real heroes of the story of evolution, are not species. That's how Darwin understood it. There was species that adapted and adapted and adapted, and eventually became entirely different species. Speciation gave way to the broad spectrum and variety of things that we see today. But Dawkins and others have taken evolution away from taking place at the species level to a gene-centered evolutionary model. Now what's actually evolving, and the real heroes of the evolutionary plot, are your genes, which store your DNA. And those DNA, of course, not having a mind or a will, and he's very clear on that. But the idea is basically this, that you are simply a box, and a dog is simply a box, and any living creature is basically a box that contains DNA, and the real purpose, the selfish gene, and this, of course, is attributing to genes something that they don't possess, but the idea is that they're just looking for self-propagation, okay? That the whole biological world revolves around the principle of selfishness, the principle of self-preservation, okay? Now, taking it still a step further yet, Michael Roos, philosopher of biology at Florida State University, says ethics, remember this was Ben Carson's point, ethics, as we understand it, is an illusion fobbed off on us by our genes to get us to cooperate. So here the idea of don't kill, don't murder, don't hurt, be nice to people, do unto others as you would have them do to you, is really just something that our genes have somehow, miraculously, how it's happened we don't know, persuaded us to believe so that we wouldn't kill all one another at one time, so that they could continue to be propagated in better and still better and more evolved forms. Now, some of you are sitting there thinking, what? No, that's not. Well, let's take it even further still. This man is a man by the name of Dr. Francis Crick. He is a scientist and a Nobel Prize winner in 1962, in fact, for the discovery with Dr. James Watson of the double helix structure of the deoxyribonucleic acid molecule. He received the Nobel Prize. Crick, though brilliant, and no one would take that away from him, he died in 2004, I think, of colon cancer, had this to say about, well, you, and I guess about me. He says, you. Now, I want you to think about yourself. You, your joys and your sorrows, your memories and ambitions, your sense of personal identity. David Asherick, August 16th, 1972, Cheyenne, Wyoming. Me. 2 sons, Landon David and Jabal Atkins Asherick. 1 wife, Violetta Asherick. Me, my personal identity, and my free will. My decision not to wear a tie tonight. My decision to marry Violetta. My decision to wear these shoes. My decision to come here tonight. My decision to come to Australia. And every decision that I ever have made or ever will make. My free will. You, your joys, your sorrows, your memories, your ambitions, your sense of personal identity, and your free will are in fact no more than the behavior of a vast assembly of nerve cells and their associated molecules. Now, this is what is classically known, this is what is known as reductionism, in which something that is complex is reduced, and then still further reduced, and then still further reduced, and then still further reduced, until we get down to the most basic, reductive picture possible of reality, and that is that everything that we see around us, all of the complexity, all of the beauty, all of the tapestry of human emotions and human relationships is really just a bunch of things bumping into one another at very high speeds. Now, you might be sitting there thinking, what? I don't feel like a collection of atoms right now that are bumping into one another, but in fact, says Crick, that is all that you are. No one would deny that at some level you are that, but Crick's point and Rousseau's point and Dawkins' point and Provine's point is that that is all you are. But let's take it to the final extreme. I think this is the final extreme here. Dr. Peter Atkins, author and scientist, has said this: science has no need of purpose. All the extraordinary, wonderful richness of the world can be expressed as growth from the dunghill of purposeless, interconnected corruption. Isn't that nice? The beautiful tapestry, as he calls it, the wonderful richness of the world, is little more than the growth from the dunghill of purposeless, interconnected corruption. So, beloved, you thought you lived in Australia, you thought your life had meaning, but really everything, all of the diversity, all of the complexity, all of the rich tapestry and joys of the human experience are little more than a steaming pile of dung, of which you are but a tiny part. Now, I want to remind us here that these are not quacks and weirdos. These are inarguably the priests of our day. Science has become the new religion for many, and these are the high priests of scientism. And we want to make a distinction between science, which we are in favor of, and scientism, which is what we're talking about here. These are some radical ideas. These are the ideas that are being taught by many in the most prestigious universities in the world. Now, maybe Ben Carson was onto something. Maybe there was something to his idea that if you believe in evolution, it's a little bit like a great illustration that I'll use here is when I took my son fishing about 3 or 4 years ago. My oldest son, we went out fishing in a boat, and I love to fish, and he loves to fish, and we were at a little pond there. And my son was sort of watching. He was younger than he is now, about 7 years old, and he was watching what Papa did. And what Papa would do is he would pull up to a little cove with the boat, and he would get the boat in just the right place where we could cast out over what looked to be some promising water. And then Papa would go to the back of the boat, and he would throw the anchor in, and the anchor would go down, and then we would go to the front of the boat, and we would begin to fish. And Landon had seen this done several times, and so when we came to a particular bay, I was busy fiddling with something, and I wasn't exactly in the place I wanted to be at, but I heard a plop, a splash, and I looked back, and Landon has thrown the anchor in. The problem is that he's thrown it in much too deep of water, and he's not looked to be sure that the anchor rope is clear of things. And I look, and the anchor rope is tied around my fishing rod, and the anchor rope is tied around my lunch, and worse yet, the anchor rope is tied around my son. And all wrapped up, and Landon is just doing what Dad does. He throws the anchor in. So in goes the anchor, and there goes the fishing rod, there goes the lunch, and my son is on the verge of being dragged to the bottom of this lake, and his father's going to have to jump in. And so, in a moment of panic, I run over, I grab the anchor rope to stop it from going. The lunch is in the water, the fishing pole is in the water, but fortunately my son was saved and preserved. And I don't want to make myself out to sound like too much of a hero here. It wasn't terribly dramatic, but it was a very interesting point. And that is this. We sometimes just get rid of something, and then we, like an anchor, we just get rid of it, and we think, well, that's that, and now we're all done. But maybe what happens with evolution is that when you throw that over, it brings this with it, and it also brings this. There are implications. It entails a view of reality, a view of what you see in the morning when you're brushing your teeth. It changes the way that you view that little baby. It's as if it changes everything And that was kind of Ben Carson's point. Now, why are people protesting so much if this is exactly the thing that some of the premier academicians are telling us is in fact the case? What ends up happening if this view of reality is correct, this radical Darwinism, and by the way, this isn't science, this is unrestrained Darwinism. I want to make a distinction there, and I'll get to that in just a second. Lots of things begin to sort of flow out from this, as we've already seen. Number one, no God. Certainly there's no room for God in the universe. There's no meaning in life. There's no ground, no solid ground for morality or ethics, so you just do whatever you want to do. Might makes right. If Hitler wants to exterminate, 20 million people, several million Russian and Ukrainians and Jews, and that's fully his right. If Pol Pot wants to kill millions and Stalin wants to kill 20 million of his own people, it's just no problem. He's just going to do what he wants to do. There's no ground for ethics. No free will, which is your personal decisions that you're making to do this or not to do this. Your personal identity has been robbed from you. There's no genuine relationality. What that means is you don't really have an actual relationship with someone that you think is your son or your daughter or your father or your mother or your spouse. They're just a bouncing bag of atoms, and you're just a bouncing bag of atoms, and the whole thing is a grand illusion. And know, as Michael Roos says, wonderful richness of the world. Well, at this point, rather than continuing to stretch the rubber band of credulity, I'd like to just stop and maybe hear from another scientist, a voice of what we might call reason in this morass of strangeness. This is a man by the name of Dr. John Polkinghorne. He's a theoretical physicist. He also happens to be a theologian. Listen to what he says. Scientism destroys rationality, that is, logic, thinking in a linear, correct way. Scientism destroys rationality. Thought is replaced by electrochemical neural events. Two such events cannot confront each other in rational discourse. In other words, what's going in your brain is just a bunch of bouncing particles, and what's going on in my brain is just a bunch of bouncing particles. They are neither right nor wrong. They simply happen. The very assertions of the reductionist himself are nothing but blips in the brain. The world of rational discourse dissolves into the absurd chatter of firing synapses. And notice what Polkinghorne says here. Quite frankly, that cannot be right, and none of us believes it to be so. Finally, a voice of reason in this morass of misinformation. He says this cannot possibly be the case, and there's no one that actually believes this. Now, they may say they believe it, but in fact they don't. As we think about the nature of life, as we think about the things that are important to us, things like family and friends, spouse, and falling in love, as we think about the smell of a rose or the taste of an orange or the joy of a family reunion, if in fact that's a joy in your family, the singer for the band U2, Bono, he has this amazing line where he basically says that freedom has a scent like the top of a newborn baby's head. And anyone who's ever smelled a baby, in the good moments, not the other moments, knows that there's this freshness, there's this newness, there's this beauty that probably only a new mother and a new father can fully understand. Family and friends and hopes and dreams and loves and passions and fears and triumphs and ambitions. This is the life that we live in. This is where we're at. This is the world that we actually believe in. But what we're told by the most premier of not all, but many of the most premier scientists is that in fact this is not what reality is about, and this is not what life is about. Now, fortunately, this is not something that all scientists believe. In fact, I've just recently picked up a book and started reading it that I'm finding absolutely fascinating, titled Uncommon Descent: Intellectuals Who Find Darwinism Unconvincing. So I want to be clear, this is not what everybody believes, but it's what a great many believe. And our question tonight was, who was right, Jesus or Darwin? Which view of reality is the correct one? Is it the Darwinian worldview with the dunghill of happiness that we're living on? Or is there another view of reality, something that's more in keeping with the way that we actually think and feel and interact? And if there is another view of reality, is it a good one? Is it a defensible one? And most importantly, is it true? This man right here is a man by the name of C.S. Lewis. And C.S. Lewis was a scholar, he was an author, he was a broadcaster, a philosopher, and one of my favorite authors and a man who was absolutely brilliant on so many levels. Listen to what he says here. Friendship, he says, is unnecessary. Now, of course, he doesn't believe this. He's saying this is the position of unrestrained Darwinism and scientism. Friendship, he says, in an atheistic world is unnecessary, like philosophy, like art. It has no survival value. Rather, it is one of those things that give value to survival. Why friendship? Why hopes? Why dreams? Why music? Why philosophy? Why arts? Why beauty? Why love? Again, he says, when all that says it is good has been debunked, what says I want remains. It's very interesting. In the opening passages of the Bible, Lewis is making an unambiguous reference here to the opening chapters of Scripture that say, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. And God looked at everything that He had made, and He said, it is good. And Lewis's point is a fantastically profound one. He says, when all that says it is good has been debunked, what says I want remains. Selfishness. Hey, that was Dawkins' basic point. Selfish genes. That was Michael Roos's basic point. That all we are is machines for the propagation of DNA and our genes. But is this really true? On August 2nd, 2005, 319 people boarded Air France flight 358. The flight was prepared to land in Pearson International Airport, Toronto, Canada, but the flight missed the runway. And as it missed the runway, it skidded off the end of the runway and began to burst into flames. There were 309 people on board. And as the word was getting out that a plane had crashed, the minister for the Department of Transportation of Canada made the announcement, the sad announcement, that her deepest condolences went out to the families of those who lost loved ones today, because as many as 200 had died on Flight 358 in Air France. But in reality, that's not what had happened. Something amazing had happened. Yes, in fact, the plane had crashed, and yes, in fact, it had gone right off the end of the runway, but people saw the plane go off the end of the runway. Ordinary people just like you. They saw it. And they stopped their cars, and this is an actual picture. They began to get out of their cars, and they began to run to the plane. And they ran to this firing, burning mass that people were piling out of. And of the various doors, many of them were broken, the slides weren't working, and ordinary people, just like you and myself, this is another picture, began to assist and get people out. Now, Mark Stein, I think his name was, a columnist, let me check that, Mark Stein, excuse me, wrote this 6 days later. Eyewitness accounts vary. Some people are said to have panicked, others to have stayed calm. Passing motorists pulled off the road and hurried toward the burning jet to help any survivors. Can you imagine? Running at top speed toward that. What are they doing? To help survivors. Of the 8 emergency exits, 2 were deemed unsafe to use, and on a third and a fourth, the slides didn't work. Nonetheless, in a chaotic situation, hundreds of strangers coordinated sufficiently to evacuate a small space through 4 exits in less than a couple of minutes before the Airbus was consumed by flames. No one was killed. Not one person lost their life, and within moments of the last person going off, the thing burst into flames and was consumed. Now, it's not easy to reconcile that picture of reality with what we're being told about our selfish genes, and what we're being told that really it's just all about me and my survival and my propagation. What would cause a human being who was just driving happily, merrily on his or her way to work to stop and go racing toward a fiery jet? What would cause ordinary people, not 1 or 2 or 3, these aren't just a few heroes, but hundreds of bystanders to run? Why would they do that? Well, because the way that they view the world is probably similar to the way that you view the world. Life has meaning. Life has purpose. Life has hope. There's something special about human beings. There's something special about a mother, about a father, about a child. There's something special about a marriage. Something worth living for, something worth endangering your own life for, and even, if need be, something worth dying for. Lewis said, when all that says it is good has been done away with, all that remains is, I want, I want. But maybe we've gotten rid of God just a little too soon. Maybe we threw that anchor overboard and we said, you know, this God hypothesis, we're secular Australia. We're modern Australia. We have all of the amenities of modernity. We don't need that hypothesis anymore, and we are throwing it. But what if the anchor rope is tied around our own leg? What if the anchor rope is around our marriage? What if it's around our national identity? What if it's around what gives life meaning and hope and purpose? What if it's tied around the things that are most important to us? What then? Maybe we should give the Bible just a little more thought than we had before. Maybe Jesus had something very significant to say. Maybe he was who he claimed to be. Just as Charles Darwin went on a journey in 1831, the Bible tells the story of another journey, an amazing journey, a journey that was taken by a little babe in a manger. This was an extraordinary little babe, not any ordinary babe, but this was Emmanuel, God in the flesh, God coming down to live as one of us, to breathe as one of us, and ultimately to die as one of us. Not unlike those individuals and bystanders that ran right toward the fiery plane of Air France 358, Jesus is depicted in Scripture as running headlong into a dangerous and difficult situation at the cost and expense of his own life to save others. Now, I want you to appreciate these two pictures of reality. They cannot both be true. One picture of reality says that the universe is fundamentally selfish, and it's all about the preservation of me and my survival and my genes and my DNA. That reality at its most basic, rudimentary, fundamental level is fundamentally selfish. But then there's this other view of reality that says, no, actually, reality at its most basic, basement, rudimentary level is about love and kindness and selflessness. Now this raises a question. Who was right? Darwin or Jesus? Which is the correct pair of glasses? How should we view the world? As a bunch of boxes of atoms and pieces bumping together for the propagation of DNA, or as something different, something more whole, something more complete, and something a whole lot more beautiful? When it comes to the question of God, Jesus said things like, if you have seen me, you have seen the Father. If you've seen the way that I treat people, the way that I interact with the oppressed and with the condemned and with the hypocrites and with all stripes and persons of humanity, he says, that's how God is. If you have seen me, he said, you have seen the Father. When it came to the question of meaning, Jesus said, no longer do I call you servants, because a servant doesn't know what his master is doing. He said to those, his disciples, and to us today, I call you friends. What a strange thing. Jesus, was he really God, and did he really say that people were his friends? When it comes to the issue of ethics, Jesus said a very interesting thing. He says, I'm telling you to love one another. Love one another, treat one another with kindness and respect and grace and magnanimity. When it comes to the issue of free will, Jesus said, for God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whoever believes, whoever makes a choice, whoever makes a decision, whoever exercises his free will not perish, but have everlasting life. When it comes to the issue of personal identity, Jesus said that greater love has no man than this. The issue of personal identity is that behold what manner of love God has bestowed upon us, that we should be called the sons and daughters of God. You're not just a bouncing group of atoms running into one another. You're, according to Jesus, God's own daughter and God's own son. When it comes to the issue of genuine relationality, Jesus said, greater love has no man than this, that a man would lay down his life for his friends. That we actually can interact with people and give our lives to them in marriage, or as fathers, or as parents, or as children, or just as friends. And when it comes to the wonderful richness of the world, all things that according to Provine and Roos and others, all of these things that really aren't in the world, Jesus said, I am come that they might have life, and that they might have it more abundantly. A very strange thing happened to Charles Darwin. A strange thing, but maybe something that you could have almost predicted. This is again from B. Warfield, writing in 1888. He said, readers of the sad account which Mr. Darwin appended at the very end of his life to his autobiographical notes of how at about the age of 30 or thereabouts, his higher aesthetic taste began to show atrophy, so that he lost his love for poetry, for art, for music, and his mind more and more began to take upon it the character of a kind of machine for grinding general laws out of large collections of facts, will not be able to resist the suspicion that this exclusive direction to one type of thinking was really, as he himself believed, injurious to his intellect, as well as enfeebling to his emotional nature, and lay at the root of his subsequent drift away from religion. What an interesting thing. What a fascinating thing for someone to say. That as Darwin began to think more and more about his theory and about human beings just in this pell-mell passion to survive and to propagate and to be the fittest, that he began to lose his interest in poetry and in art and in music, and he began to be more like a machine. What is it that makes something beautiful? What is it that makes a melody beautiful? Or the string of a violin just so perfect, just as if it's been perfectly made and calculated by God Himself to set the human emotions stirring? What is it about the taste of an orange or the cooing and giggling of a baby? What is it about the looking of a man into the eyes of a woman and a woman into the eyes of a man at the altar of marriage in which they pledge themselves to one another? What is it about looking at a glorious and grand sunset that stretches out over the beautiful Australian ocean and just looking out and seeing how glorious and what is it? What is it about life, this rich tapestry of relational, creative, musical, artistic, philosophical beauty? It's almost like we were made for joy. We were made for happiness. We were made for purpose. We were made to enjoy life. One of the great things about this view of reality is that the Bible itself becomes not an old, ancient, antiquated book, not a book that was written just for people in bygone times, and not a book of superstitions or strange things. But fundamentally, the Bible is a story about love. And contained within its pages is none other than the great three-word line found in the New Testament, that God is love. Wow. What if that were true? What if that picture of reality were the correct one? That God is love and He has sought to bring love into our lives, to love God with all of our heart, mind, and soul, but also to love our neighbor as ourselves. What if that's the purpose of life? What if that's why we're here? What if that is what it's really all about? As we close, the Bible ends with an amazing story that Jesus was not just God with us. He didn't just come to bring an amazing message. But the New Testament story is that Jesus came and He died. We're going to talk about in the future on night number 4, who killed Jesus and why did He die? But the point is this: if this is a true story, then it tells us a lot about reality. And it tells us a lot about how we should view ourselves, and how we should view one another, and how we should view the world around us. Even just strictly from an aesthetic point of view, from a poetic point of view, from a beauty point of view, what a story. A story of God becoming a man and giving up everything as a perfectly selfless individual. And so it does raise the question, doesn't it? It raises the question, was Dr. Carson onto something? Maybe he was. Maybe he was onto something when he said that if we believe in the theory of evolution, a whole lot is entailed. The foundation for ethics goes, and as we've discovered here, according to some, the foundation for life and love and relationship and rationality as we know it. Two pictures. In one picture, the most basic truth about the world is selfishness. And in the other picture, the most basic truth about the world is selflessness. Who was right? Maybe Ben Carson and maybe Jesus were on to something.